So we'll start with Ted Knowlton. Ted is the Deputy Director at Wasatch Front Regional Council, the Metropolitan Planning Organization for the Salt Lake and Ogden-Layton metropolitan areas. Ted has focused, Ted has focused his career on coordinating local placemaking with regional infrastructure planning. Prior to joining WFRC, he worked with Reganesi Associates, Envision Utah, and the Planning Center, now PlaceWorks. His experience includes efforts in Chicago, Denver, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake City that have garnered 2 prestigious Daniel Burnham Awards from the American Planning Association. In Utah, he led the development of Wasatch Choice, the region's original official vision. Ted has a master's in urban and regional planning from Portland State University and is an adjunct professor at the University of Utah, and is a distinguished alumni of the College of Architecture and Planning at the University of Utah. He is the president of the Utah chapter of the American Planning Association and is the Planning Commission chair for North Salt Lake City. Julie Bjornstad, AICP, is a transportation planner for the Wasatch Front Regional Council, focusing on long-range planning, performance management, policy, and transportation finance. Her passion lies in improving the livability of our communities and in informing decision-making with data. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Applied Mathematics from the Georgia Institute of Technology and a Master of City and Regional Planning from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Ted and Julie, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so happy that you're here. Before we get started, really quick as a side note, if you have any questions for Julie or for Ted, please put them in the chat box. This is a roundtable session set up in a meeting style, which means that you will all have the opportunity to mute yourselves, unmute yourselves, contribute to the conversation. I know that Ted and Julie are both hoping that this is a really productive conversation. But before I turn over to Julie, we're going to run a quick poll just to find out real quick who's joining us today. So Tanner, do you want to go ahead and throw that poll up there? So if you will just go really quickly and just select the choice that fits you. Just really quick, we've got quite a few people on this call. We've got Kim Struthers. Thank you, Kim, for joining us. Kim is the Community Development Director from Lehigh City. We're happy that you're here. We have got Council Member Don Fitzpatrick with Layton City, Mayor Bigelow with West Valley City, Mayor Dirk Burton with West Jordan City, and the list goes on. So thank you all so much for joining us today. We will go ahead and now turn the time over to Julie. Thanks, Julie.
Great. I will share a couple slides. So I just wanted to give a little overview of what we did this morning. At 10 this morning, we had a parking modernization session. And I'm not sure how many of you guys were able to join us on that, but we had about 40 people in the audience. So hopefully there's some overlap between those who attended that session and those who attended this. But otherwise, I'm just going to give a brief overview of what we did. We kind of started the session by talking about where our parking standards come from. A lot of our parking standards are developed through guides like the Institute of Traffic Engineers Parking Generation Manual and other parking standards that rely heavily on data that was collected in the 80s and 90s, even into the early 2000s, and low density single-use developments that didn't really have a lot of access to transit or active transportation. And then these standards were kind of copied from one city to the next. So unless your city has recently done sort of parking overhaul, chances are that at least the basis of your parking codes are formed in this sort of data that hasn't been updated recently. And we know that a lot has changed in the last 30, 40 years. There's now more shared mobilities, there's increased online shopping, more centering, innovative parking technologies. And so we really need to overhaul the planning tools that we're using to align better with these shifts that we're seeing. We have there's a lot of consequence in terms of financial, environmental, built environment consequences from having a surplus in parking. It's making our cities more expensive, more congested, and more polluted. Studies have shown that parking supply is the single biggest predictor of parking demand. And excess parking also spreads out those destinations so that travel by transit, walking, and biking, sort of as shown in this picture on the screen, becomes more difficult and less attractive, leading to more congestion and worse air quality. Too much parking also takes away from our built environment and economic development. Valuable urban land that could instead be put to a more productive and beneficial use is now tied up in parking. And this includes the development of open space, affordable housing, and other uses that potentially provide higher tax bases to our communities. So the question, so we want to have this roundtable discussion, like Katie said, we want we want you all to be involved in the discussion. So you all have the ability to mute and unmute yourself. Feel free to talk out loud instead of entering into the session or into the comment box. I'm going to turn it over to Ted, who's going to explain sort of the breakout sessions and maybe a little bit more of what we want to get out of today.
Thanks, Julie. And it's great to be here with you. I find that, and I suspect you all do as well, that at the League of Cities and Towns conference, this is an opportunity for us to share our experiences, one community to the next. And I think that the nature of this conversation is not about directing questions to the meeting facilitator, but directing questions to each other and learning from each other. And so I hope that you take this sort of that spirit of the roundtable here into what happens. So we're going to break out into 2 groups. And in those groups, I would suggest that you start with the question of, how do you begin? Let's say that you're a community and you want to modernize your parking. One question is, so how do you start? How do you even begin? And I would suggest that's a first question. Now, there's so many issues and challenges that come up one community to the next that I think that there will be a robust conversation that happens after that. Now, Julie, do you have anything that you want to add to that? Those instructions? Okay. So we have 45 people, so there'll be about 20 in each group, and there's a whiteboard where you can record ideas, and then what I would suggest is take a note of your key points that resonate across your group. Pick a spokesperson, and we're going to do a check-in. We're going to bring everybody back halfway through and do a check-in, and then we'll go back into the breakouts one additional time. Does that make sense? So our time clock is that it's 3:10, and this goes until as late as 4:15. It doesn't, necessarily have to go that long. And so we will break out for 20 minutes, and then come back for a conversation, and then break out again for about 20 minutes. Okay, Julie, because we beat you guys in time.
You also beat us in whiteboards, because that was my first time, and I did not have everyone write on it like you did, which was actually a super good idea. So you beat us in more ways than one, I think. I'm
pretty awesome. I mean, I don't know what else.
Actually, we talked about how you weren't that awesome, but.
So that was really fast, but I think, maybe, well, so here's where we're at. We didn't even have time to kind of really look at what we did here, but here's what you're looking at, everybody. Our group grappled with what brought them to this conversation. What brings them to the desire to want to modernize parking? What are the objectives in their community? And they peppered the whiteboard with that. And then what we did is they couldn't vote for their own, but they were putting check marks down as they want to talk about. And so I think what this does is it may be a way to queue up how we use the rest of our time together as a roundtable. It could be that one breakout coalesces around a couple of these objectives, and the other one does a different one. So that's where we're at. If I just glance at this, some of the stuff, Springdale has significant issues relating to a major parking generator, namely the national park, but there might be some corollaries to other communities that have a major generator that they got to deal with. The large retailer question and finding the Goldilocks process there. That was a big one. There's a desire for streamlining the development process. And then there are two that are perhaps a little bit related to each other: downtown revitalization and promoting patterns of development that, and I'm sorry, I've got the thing, that are not auto-centric. So there's sort of placemaking ones, there's the development process, and there's the major generator. I'm gonna pause and see if others from my group want to elaborate on what I missed on that. Julie, let's hear where you guys are at, and then we'll make a game plan together about the use of our time.
Yeah, so our group focused, and I decided that I'm not thinking today. I took a photo with my phone instead of a screen capture like you. But our group focused on sort of the first step of how we can start the process of updating parking codes. So we took a little poll. We had Payson, Harriman, Sandy, and Pleasant View wanting to start the process. South Salt Lake, North Salt Lake, and Ogden being somewhere in progress, and then Orem and Clearfield having completed at least part of their city or total city parking updates. And we kind of just started talking about, what the best ways to start were, including kind of getting an accurate picture of what you are in your current environment. So that's data collection. Ogden collects data in 10-year intervals, so they have a lot of data going back. Ogden and Clearfield brought in consultants to do analysis of taxable land value and redevelopment. So kind of understanding that story, and then getting the context of where you want to go. So developing sort of goals and objectives with your community. Doing some outreach with local businesses and the public to understand their experiences and what their stories are as sort of the top ways of starting the process towards modernization. So we may have had a different question than you guys, because you guys, it seems like you were on a different page.
There, like mine. So we started there with that very question of, where are you at in this process? Are you just starting in the middle, or pretty advanced? And most of the communities on our side were, I think, kicking the tires on the idea. We had Brigham City and Layton that are further into it. That was where we were at on this.
Okay. Yeah, we had just started getting into talking about how to deal with the public, and Greg had a good question. Greg, which I now forgot, but I remember saying maybe we should pause and have this in the other breakout session. So I don't know if that's where we want to go, or if there was another topic that you guys had started approaching.
To me, there is low-hanging fruit, which is changing the parking requirements that may exist citywide. And you might say that's low-hanging fruit. Well, all I mean is that at least the process to get there is pretty straightforward. It's recalibration. Politically, there might be challenges, and there are questions about, well, how do you maximize the utility of parking, let's say in a downtown, in a mixed use environment, and that can be a lot more challenging. When we were getting at the objective side, I saw some people sort of exploring that downtown revitalization, sort of that higher level, harder challenge. It might be managing parking, managing public parking. It might be those kinds of techniques. And then there are maybe many of you who are not actually interested in that kind of like brain damage. And so that might be a way that we reorganize the breakouts. Does that make sense to do a separation that way? And then we'll drill down into those two kinds of paths.
Will you
Mayor
just restate
Bigelow,
the
did you want
paths?
to say something on that? Okay.
Will you just restate the paths really quick?
I think one path is you want to do a citywide recalibration, parking requirements. And another path might be, no, I'm more interested in doing something more aggressive that may be more suited towards a downtown environment. And how do I really maximize the use of limited parking in that kind of environment? Which is, it's harder. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. And they're very different kinds of objectives that I think lead to a different kind of breakout conversation.
Yeah, are there any other questions from those of you who are partway through or wanting to start that you want questions answered for? Is there any other questions that you would like to discuss now that everyone's here and you have sort of open opportunity?
This is Mayor Bigelow, West Valley City. I guess we're a little different spot from most of these cities. We have done numerous studies, both of Utah cities and different states, and what works in different areas. And we have a pretty robust parking standard for our city. Being a little larger city, we have staff to do that. The other thing we found is that depending on what part of the city we're in, it is significantly different. What works in one part of the city does not work in another. I guess the main thing that we're trying to decide now, because we constantly battle with parking, is that we have to decide what we want to be in each city, because we don't have to face issues like Springdale or whatever. We're built out mostly, but we have residential areas that become parking lots. Streets so crowded that you can't drive a fire truck down it. You can't plow the snow. And then you have people complaining about that. And you, at the same time, the people who are filling it up are complaining that there's not enough parking. So you just have to decide, I think, where you want to go and head for it, because there are no right and wrong answers. Because we're living with every one of the problems that you've brought up at some place in our city. Wish we weren't, but that's it. Anyway.
Can I ask another question as well? I remember years ago with a large retailer that their standards, at least they used to be more stringent, or they required more, like the anchor tenant required more parking than even our code required. And it would be a fight to try to reduce their parking down from what I call the Black Friday parking, day after Thanksgiving parking. And I'm just wondering if that's changed nowadays, if a lot of the large retailers, and that may change even more after this pandemic, but are a lot of the retailers reducing their required parking, or are they still mandating a certain standard, minimum standard?
This is Tim with Layton, and I appreciate that question because some of our slides in our public review featured aerial shots in December of some of our larger, and I would say still successful big box users, but a lot of empty space out in the parking lot. And we just kind of did a little vignette showing the potential for additional building sites and maybe a pedestrian plaza, just to say right sizing parking could encourage infill development in some of these areas. And so we are trying to start to send, I think the parking amendments as the first signal to then have follow-up conversations with retailers. And then start to encourage the infill conversations, the shared use, the joint use parking, more efficient use of land, better tax base, all the benefits that go with that. And I would argue better atmosphere for the success of the stores, obviously looking at the year-round average and not just a holiday weekend. But overall, we found that we were high in our big box retail and larger retailer parking in terms of standards. Definitely the use observations show that the parking is underutilized. And our multifamily, and then a couple of uses like hair salon were too high. Most of the others were not necessarily too high, but we found that there could be better approaches to explore shared and joint use parking and potential parking reductions.
Hey, Steve, your question brings up a point for me. I remember reading a New York Times article a while ago about COVID and how restaurants in New York were shutting down. This guy was opening this restaurant in Florida, and he was able to take his entire restaurant and socially distance it outside in the parking lot. And I was thinking, that's insane that we can we have enough parking in our parking lots to not only serve existing restaurants, but also then rebuild the restaurants socially distanced. And I'm wondering if any of you guys are experiencing, especially now with COVID, people coming in asking to use parking lots or parking spaces for outside eating or for outside shopping, and whether you think that that's going to continue sort of into the future with or without COVID. Do you see that people are sort of urging to redevelop some of that parking for other uses?
We're allowing all of our restaurants to use their parking lots for dining right now, and many of are taking advantage of it. And I think it's going to be a look afterwards saying, hey, why not continue? Because a lot of people want to be able to eat outside, have that experience. So I can see us definitely saying, yes, go ahead and do it.
Can I chime in on Steve's question? Just last year, I had a discussion with Boyer Development, asking them that exact question Steve had about reduction in parking. Boyer does a lot of office, some retail, not necessarily a lot of mixed use or very urban, a little urban. And their response to me was, yes, we're willing to do it a little bit. And they were representing their retailers. And it was kind of a reduction of, like, instead of 5 stalls per 1,000 down to 4. So at least that conversation, it was like they want to give a little, they want to come down a little, but it's not going to be a dramatic change for office and retail. Multifamily is very different. I've heard from a number of multifamily developers, they want to come down. They've done studies showing how much extra money they're paying, how much extra parking they have in general on, especially the ones that are near good transit. They're seeing that overparked component.
So there is, the age-old challenge to parking reform is concerns over spillover parking, right? That's always out there. There's some distance that can be made in parking reform that is just right sizing, where you still may not see much spillover. But the very nature of sort of really right sizing parking means that you're letting supply more closely approximate demand, which means that there's going to be times where there will be spillover. And my question to you all is, how have you dealt with that? Politically or technically? What are the solutions that you would share with each other about the concern about spillover parking? Am I right? I mean, is this something you've heard about? And
Ted, this Ron Bigelow. We had a huge example in our city a big apartment complex was built right to a nice middle-class neighborhood, and they didn't have enough parking spots. In fact, they started charging for them. So all of the apartment people went over into the single-family home neighborhood and was parking on their streets. They were parking at the school, and it became a huge problem, so huge that ultimately, politically, we had to ban parking, and we had to threaten the apartment complex owner. And then we had to hire some parking enforcement officers to go out and patrol it regularly. It was so bad that kids couldn't cross in the school crossing walks to get to school. So it's very real. And we were unprepared for that, but we sure took a lot of flack politically over that whole issue. And it cost us.
We had a case where there was an old school that had been abandoned, and the Park and Rec department wanted to convert it to a museum and an event center. And the neighbors were just up in arms at this idea of having, hundreds of people come for an event and take up all the street parking. And so they wanted to shut it down completely. So we had long meetings with the neighbors and got their buy-in to what would be a solution. And the point was the events were only like maybe once a week. And so we said, hey, when you do an event, you've got to provide a shuttle. There's a city parking lot 2 blocks away. Just direct everybody there and shuttle the people 2 blocks to your event. And that was the solution that we came up with.
Who paid for the shuttle? Was that city provided or was that the venue?
It was the venue. The venue had to pay that. That was part of their conditional use permit.
Ted, I want to ask in line with your question, have any of the communities here had any success or tried parking authorities where you essentially either the city or a developer kind of looks at it from a block level and does shared parking or different parking facilities to manage it from looking at it more as a utility rather than an on-site, so many stalls per building, but more looking at it as the utility from a bigger picture and getting properties to share parking, kind of a parking authority idea.
This is Dawn. Is Tim going to weigh in on this question by chance? So in Layton, we just passed the parking ordinance a week or so ago. And one of the things that we are doing in some of the areas with multi-use or other businesses is looking at shared parking contracts that actually go with the land. And that it has to be within 500 feet of that facility. So whether they share with another business, just down the street, that's one of the ways that we looked at our concern of some of the areas that may not have quite enough parking, but to guarantee that there would be something there in the future.
Dawn, I love that idea. And is that something, if other communities wanted to learn from that, what would they look up in Layton?
Well, our ordinance literally just got passed last city council meeting. So I'm not sure exactly where it is in the posting on our municipal code. I'm sure Tim spent hours and hours on this ordinance. He's not kidding. It's rather lengthy. I think every question that all of you have had is addressed in that ordinance somewhere, with residential problems with, trailers or on-street parking of businesses at residential. This issue of what about, shared parking or any of that kind of stuff is in this new ordinance. And if it's not online in the Layton Municipal Code, I'm sure that Tim could probably, or I could too, provide a copy of it. It is, read it so many times, it's got to be 45, 50 pages long. It's a very comprehensive ordinance.
It is live. And, you know, I think the reason it's long is because the shared parking options, even an option to have a period of time. Let's see, it's called performance parking that we, Chad Wilkinson had used in, I think, Reno when he spent some time in Nevada. But basically, that there's an 18-month period for a developer to demonstrate that a phase of the plan only needs a certain amount of parking. That's then reviewed and could be granted approval 18 months later before they continue with additional phases. So there's some pretty new tools that I had not been familiar with that we just look forward to applying them and then continuing to learn what other cities are doing.
Thanks, Tim. I suspect that when you all were, go ahead. Hi, somebody there. Go ahead.
Follow up to
I'm so sorry.
follow up for Leighton, either for
Your audio is cutting in and out. We're not able to hear you. Is it possible for you to put your comment in the chat box?
And I'm using the whiteboard again, and I think the whiteboard purpose here is when you have 40 participants, you may feel like, well, I don't feel comfortable jumping in, or you know, you're waiting your turn and you're not sure when Ted is going to stop talking, and which is always a question. And so I am throwing this out here. So when you circled this on your agenda for the league conference, and then you showed up for a parking roundtable, did you have a burning question about parking that you hoped to get answered? If that fits the bill for you, put it into this whiteboard.
And thank you. We just saw your email about following up with Layton City afterwards. I apologize that the audio wasn't coming through for all of us to hear your comment.
Katie, and you can give, Katie, help people know how to use the whiteboard. What do they need to do?
Right, so up in the very top of the screen, it says view options. If you use that arrow, click down, it'll say annotate. Go ahead and click on the annotate button and it'll bring up a menu for you to use a chat box. Click on that chat box and you'll be able to type your comments in there. Do you want me to share my screen real quick? And oh, looks like someone else is sharing. I apologize.
I want to throw out a really simple thing while you're taking a minute to do that. Some of you may feel like, you know, I'm not up for a big data collection effort. Julie did a great job of recognizing the basic fact that a bunch of cities' parking standards haven't changed for many decades. And even when they were first crafted, they weren't crafted locally. They were just copied from a neighboring community. It's a very simple thing to do to get the latest version of the Institute of Traffic Engineers parking generation. I think it's volume 5. Get that volume because it's recent data and it also provides data based on context. So it provides parking generation if it's urban or suburban, if there's transit nearby or not. Some of these context questions that were never in early versions of parking generation manual. So yes, it can be critiqued, but it's so much better than whatever your community might have used 20 years ago. And it's just sitting there. It's like cost you $100. Take it. You can do a quick recalibration of your parking requirements based on data that's widely acknowledged and recognized. That is low-hanging fruit.
And thank you so much, Tim. It looks like Tim has shared the municipal code. There's a link in the chat box if everybody wants to click on that to review or for reference. Thanks, Tim, for sharing that.
This whiteboard is going over like a lead balloon. It's the lead balloon board. We keep trying stuff.
And if you cannot get the whiteboard option to work, please go ahead and send your questions or your comments in the chat box, and we'll read them that way.
Now, when you all talk about parking in your communities, and you grapple with the questions of, hey, what about spillover parking or the like, and how have you dealt with it in communications, in the way that you talk about parking that you have found to be successful?
Ted, it's Tim. I think the term right sizing is a good term. It doesn't point to excess or efficient. It's just right size. It kind of has that Goldilocks, right size bed, positive ring to it. And so I think that implies not just the ratios, but the size of parking spaces. And then it opens up a lot of different categories of thought in terms of understanding specific uses. Something I was going to mention that I think relates to parking is understanding building forms and how parking can be tucked in to buildings, whether it's structured parking or a tuck-in, making buildings more efficient on a site. And how to encourage that, whether by ordinance or just by understanding of different development and product types out there that some developers may or may not be aware of. I think that's an important aspect of, especially in redevelopment and infill areas.
Thanks, Tim. Let's take one of the questions that a couple of people had. For a bedroom community with no transit and not a ton of local jobs, are there really good reasons to reduce parking standards for multifamily? Does anybody want to talk about that, weigh in on that?
I think it might depend on what the standards are. If they're pretty context sensitive, I think there might not be. Maybe walkability, neighborhood context without huge parking lots might be two reasons. But I know when we looked at your town, Ted, North Salt Lake, they had a 2.5, I think, parking requirement for one bedroom multifamily, which created quite a bit of excess parking. So when we were working with Allie, we went in and, looked at like the more context sensitive requirements for parking rather than a blanket 2 to 3 stall per unit, maybe change that to bedroom counts rather than unit counts. So I don't know if that answers.
Steve, in our morning session, we had Dan Lochran of Cowboy Partners come and give a kind of his perspective, and he had a really convincing, data on the affordability component. And so he's saying, for each parking stall additional that I need to build, he looked at how much their cities were requiring them to build versus how much was actually being used. And he figured out that it was about $63 per unit extra per month that he would have to add to the rent to pay for the price of that parking stall. And then he said, well, if that, if you're only supposed to use a third of your income for housing, then that $63 additional on your rent ends up being like $200 and something a month more you need to make in salary in order to pay for that parking. So I think he made a kind of a convincing reason from an affordability perspective of why we should be reducing some of our parking standards, especially for multifamily housing. So I think that's a really good one. Just the cost it is to build them, and that cost is transferred to the person renting, and the person renting has to make more money in order to afford a similar spot or similar apartment unit, just because there's some parking that's not being utilized.
I'll jump in that one of the issues with multifamily is a lot of those spaces are assigned to a specific unit. So if you got a 100-unit apartment complex and 200 parking spaces, that's probably enough parking spaces. But if each unit has assigned 2 parking spaces that nobody else can use, then there's no place for visitors. There's no place for the person who has 3 cars to park. And so there might be plenty of vacant parking spaces in the parking lot, but they aren't used. And I actually drafted one ordinance where it said you have to leave 50% of your parking spaces unassigned just to deal with that issue.
Can I throw out something on this multifamily question? So I think it's a great question, and part of the question is, if there's not a variety of contexts in my city, we don't really, maybe we don't have a downtown, we don't have a big job center, we don't have transit, and so talk a little bit about rationale. And I think one of the rationales is every single city has a diversity of types of people, and you can imagine if you said, well, there's one size fits all for all apartment buildings in our city. All of them have to have a swimming pool. All of them have to have Tudor architecture. All of them have to have a tot lot because everybody's the same. That's ridiculous, but we treat it that way with parking. Some people need this much parking. Some people need this much parking. If we have a variety of types of apartment buildings, and they vary with regard to the amount of parking, and the savings can be passed on to the tenant, then people will self-select. Those that don't need to consume a lot of parking, there will be options for them to take advantage of that. And those that actually maybe they need way more. They have an RV, whatever it might be. I'm not sure why you'd have an RV if you were an apartment dweller, but I'm off topic. Then if you have those options in the city, then you can pick and choose. So people aren't uniform, and that's part of the reason to say, hey, let's let the market provide us a diversity, as opposed to having a one size fits all.
Actually working here.
I said 1 minute.
Ted, we have about 5 minutes left.
Okay, let's, Greg, when land values do not drive development to compact parking, how do you reach the goal? And then maybe that's very roughly somewhat similar. Is abolishing parking minimums in commercial areas too simplistic of an approach? There's a couple of ideas there. Maybe we just take that as our closing Q&A. It's, I feel like we're just hitting our stride on this. Anybody have some thoughts on these? Greg, is your experience in Ogden that compact parking isn't happening because of, I think you're saying because of land values?
Yeah, there's just not enough value, say, in property to drive someone to build a structure, or they always go to surface parking.
Yeah.
Because it's cheaper to do. And you know, if you look at the downtown and all the surface parking lots, you look at, well, what could be here? But everyone wants to say, well, you know, it just doesn't make market sense to build anything or to share my parking with anybody. I want my own, I want to keep it, and it's cheaper to do. So how do you move to the next level? Is that just you wait for land values and development pressures to push it that way? And you look at surface parking lots more as a land bank? In the meantime, what does that do to the connectivity of the city and walkability of the city?
Yeah, Greg, we're kind of experiencing that as well, that if there's not a public partnership in the, you know, investment into the structured parking, then it's and you know, we understand the pressures that the developers face with the cost of materials and labor and land and all. It's expensive, and ultimately we all want housing affordability, and so I think what we find ourselves really working towards is in these building forms that provide a very good street front or good frontage and access onto open space areas, and use a portion of the building for tuck under. Some will say, well, no portion of tuck under is cost feasible, but we think it is based on the conversations we're having, and you know, everything from a 3-story townhome or walk up that looks more urban and feels more urban and less suburban, to the 4-story version of that, which are on recently now being constructed at Farmington Station, some great looking 4-story product with the rear garages and surface parking. And I think that product type can start to get at least towards the look and feel of the more dense, you know, TOD look and feel. So that's where we're just really trying to work through design standards. And one thing I just want to mention is that as we're trying to work with developers and test fit different development types on the ground, what we found is how much of a difference even a 2-foot reduction to our base standard from 20 feet to 18 feet is making in terms of having buildings fit comfortably and framing up nice pedestrian open space or plaza amenity areas. It's more the length of the stall than the width that we're finding to be such a valuable space saver to for both buildings and landscape area, as well as then to allow a certain percentage, depending on the neighborhood or district type of context we're in, to reduce further the width and length of parking spaces for some percentage. So anyway, that's I think we're on experiencing similar conversations as you, and that's where we're trying to explore is those types of building forms.
Okay.
So we've reached our time for today. I want to thank everyone for participating in this roundtable. We, WFRC, along with the Mountain Land Association of Governments, which is the MPO for Utah County, Udot and UTA, are currently doing a study called the Utah Parking Modernization Study. And we're working with South Salt Lake and Ogden. I think a lot of what we've talked about here is really valuable. We have the lead consultant on the phone, so she's been able to take some notes. And hopefully we'll be able to kind of roll in a lot of what we talked about today into that guidebook. I think we've also shared a lot of really good resources. So hopefully I can pull a list of attendees from this session, and maybe we can find some space on the WFRC website to share some of the parking modifications that we talked about today. I know, you know, Clearfield has some, Orem has some, Layton has some, and it would be really good to be able to share those more broadly. So I guess what I'm asking is if you and your city have done something recently and you think that it'd be useful to other communities, if you could send that to myself at julieb@wfrc.org or ted@wfrc.org, and we can start compiling some of these resources to be available to our local communities. Also, Megan and Alex are on the phone, and they head up our Transportation and Land Use Connection program. And so, Megan, I don't know if you want to make a little pitch for the fact that you can use TLC funds to do parking studies and parking code updates.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. The Transportation and Land Use Connection Program is planning technical assistance and taking a look at, you know, a parking study, understanding what kind of parking needs your city has, any revisions to parking ordinances, all those things are eligible under the program. That's for the Wasatch Front Regional Council area. If you are outside of the WFRC area, there's a sister program to the TLC program. That's called the Udot Technical Planning Assistance Program. They actually share a letter of intent this year. So you'll use the same form. You can click both boxes if you're in the WFRC area or click the Udot box if you're not. But take a look at our WFRC website, wfrc.org/TLC.
Great, thank you so much, Megan. Alex, did you have anything that you wanted to add on top of that?
No, I think that covers it.
Okay, Julie, Ted, anything else that the two of you would like to add?
Just want to thank everyone again for your time.
Yeah, and just as a reminder, we've had a lot of really important conversations today during this roundtable, and some of you may want to go back and look or listen again. And just remember that all of these sessions are being recorded, and they will be able to, you'll be able to access them following the conference. And I want to echo what Julie said. Thank you so much, Julie and Ted, for the time that you've taken to put this great session together. And thank you to all of our attendees today for joining. We've had a lot of great conversation. We appreciate all of your feedback and input. And I look forward to seeing all of you throughout the rest of the conference. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day.